Is a fast-moving river of air high in the atmosphere, typically between 5 to 9 miles above the surface, that generally flows from west to east and plays a crucial role in steering weather systems around the globe. Jet streams form where air masses of very different temperatures meet, such as cold polar air and warm tropical air, and that combination of that temperature contrast with the Earth's rotation creates these strong upper-level winds. The greater the temperature difference, the faster the wind, which is why jet streams are usually quicker in winter. There are two main types in each hemisphere. The polar jet, located between 50 and 60 degree latitude, which is stronger and has the most influence on weather, and the subtropical jet, found closer to 30 degrees latitude, which is generally higher and steadier. Jet streams have a major impact on weather patterns, troughs or southward dips, bringing colder air in storm conditions, while ridges or northward bulges allow warm, dry air to dominate. When the jet stream stalls or slows, it can lead to persistent weather extremes such as droughts or flooding. Jet streams also affect aviation because commercial flights often operate at these altitudes. Eastbound flights can gain a tailwind, shortening travel time, while westbound flights face headwinds, and the edges of the jet can produce clear air turbulence. Climate change has also influenced jet streams as the Arctic warms and the temperature difference between the poles and the equator decreases. The jet stream can become slower, wavier, and more erratic, which is linked to more frequent and persistent extreme weather events. So remember, jet streams act like a high-altitude highway in the atmosphere, guiding storms, influencing temperatures, and even affecting flight conditions.